The iron bars cast long shadows across the stone floor of the dungeon, each stripe of darkness falling like a condemnation across her brother's face. Kaela pressed her palm against the cold metal, watching as Finn lifted his head from where he sat chained to the wall, his once bright eyes now hollow with despair. The charges against him were fabricated. She knew this with the certainty that came from a lifetime of protecting him, but the kingdom's justice system cared little for truth when it came to commoners who dared to speak against the Crown's policies. "You shouldn't have come," Finn whispered, his voice hoarse from weeks of interrogation. "If they see you here, they'll assume you're part of whatever conspiracy they think I'm involved in." His wrists bore the angry red marks of shackles, and Kaela had to bite her tongue to keep from crying out at the sight of him. So thin and broken after only a month in this place. She had tried everything legal first, of course. She had petitioned the courts, sought audience with minor nobles, even attempted to gather character witnesses from their village. But Finn's crime was not theft or assault or any ordinary transgression that might be forgiven with the right words and enough coin. He had been caught distributing pamphlets questioning the king's war against the northern territories, pamphlets that called for peace negotiations instead of the bloody conquest that was draining the kingdom's coffers, filling its graveyards. In the current political climate, such thoughts were considered treason, and treason carried only one sentence. The execution was scheduled for the end of the month, barely 3 weeks away. Kaela had exhausted every conventional avenue for appeal, spent what little money their family had on lawyers who took her coin and offered nothing but empty promises in return. Now, as she stood in the suffocating darkness of the dungeon, breathing air thick with the smell of human desperation, knew there was only one path left to her, though it led through territory far more dangerous than any she had ever contemplated. "I'm going to get you out of here," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've found a way." She didn't tell him what that way was, couldn't bear to see the horror in his eyes when he realized what she intended to sacrifice for his freedom. Instead, she squeezed his fingers through the bars, memorizing the warmth of his skin, the familiar calluses from years of working their small farm together. The plan had come to her through whispered conversations in the marketplace, rumors and gossip that circulated among the common folk like currency. Lord Malric, the Dark Sorcerer of the Northern Marches, was said to be seeking a bride. Not for love, certainly not for political alliance, but for reasons that remained mysterious and therefore all the more terrifying. The stories about him were legion and contradictory. Some claimed he bathed in the blood of his enemies, others that he could kill with a glance, still others that he commanded armies of demons and dark spirits that did his bidding in exchange for human souls. What was consistent in all the tales was his power and his isolation. He lived in a fortress on the edge of the kingdom, serving as a bulwark against the wild magic that seeped from the untamed lands beyond the border. The king tolerated his presence because he was useful, a weapon pointed outward rather than inward, but no one claimed to understand him or to predict his actions. He had been offered noble daughters before, marriages that would bind him more closely to the kingdom's interests, but he had refused them all with a disdain that bordered on insult. Now, however, the rumors suggested he was actively seeking a wife, and the requirements were specific enough that they had filtered down to even the lowest levels of society. She must be unmarried, of course, and young enough to bear children, but beyond that, his preferences were surprisingly democratic. Noble birth was not required, nor was wealth or beauty or any of the other attributes typically prized in such arrangements. What he wanted, according to the whispers, was someone brave enough to approach him directly, someone willing to make the journey to his fortress and petition for his hand in person. It was this last requirement that had given Kaela hope, even as it filled her with dread. She had no illusions about her own appeal to such a man. She was pretty enough in a common way, with dark hair and darker eyes, a figure that was strong rather than delicate from years of physical labor. But she possessed none of the refinement or education that might make her interesting to a sorcerer of his reputed power. What she did have was desperation, and desperation, she had learned, could be a kind of strength all its own. The journey to his fortress took her 3 days on foot, following roads that grew progressively more deserted as she moved away from the heart of the kingdom. The landscape changed too, becoming wilder and more unsettling, with trees that seemed to lean in toward the path and shadows that moved independently of the wind. By the second day, she encountered no other travelers, and by the third, even the birds had fallen silent in the canopy above her head. The fortress itself was not what she had expected. Rather than the black stone tower of her imagination, it was built from pale granite that caught the light and threw it back in unexpected ways, creating an effect that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. It stood on a hill overlooking a valley filled with gardens that seemed impossibly lush given the late season, and as she approached the gates, she could smell the fragrance of flowers that should have been long dead by now. The guards who met her at the entrance were human, which surprised her almost as much as their courtesy. She had expected demons or undead creatures, but these were simply men in well-maintained armor who asked her business with the same professional politeness she might have encountered at any noble's residence. When she stated her purpose, they exchanged glances that seemed more concerned than alarmed, and one of them, a grizzled veteran with kind eyes, actually looked sorry for her. "You're certain about this, miss?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the formality of his words. "His lordship doesn't receive many visitors, and those who do come calling often leave changed." He didn't elaborate on what he meant by changed, but the warning was clear enough. Kaela lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm certain," she said, and meant it. Whatever Lord Malric might do to her, it couldn't be worse than watching her brother die for the crime of wanting peace instead of war. The interior of the fortress was as unexpected as its exterior. Where she had anticipated dark corridors and rooms that spoke of cruelty and dark magic, she found instead halls filled with light that seemed to come from the walls themselves, illuminating artwork that was both beautiful and strange. The floors were polished wood rather than stone, and the walls were lined with books, thousands of them, more than she had ever seen in one place. It was the library of someone who loved learning for its own sake, not the collection of someone who used knowledge only as a weapon. She was led to a receiving room that overlooked the gardens, and there she waited, trying to calm her racing heart while she rehearsed the words she had prepared. The speech she had crafted was simple and direct, an offer of marriage in exchange for her brother's freedom. She had no illusions about the transaction's nature. She was proposing to sell herself to secure Finn's life, and she was prepared to make that bargain as cleanly as possible. When Lord Malric finally entered the room, her carefully prepared words died in her throat. He was tall, as she had expected, but not gaunt or skeletal as the story suggested. Instead, he moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his dark hair longer than was fashionable, his face stern but not cruel. What struck her most, however, were his eyes. They were the color of winter storms, pale gray and completely unreadable, and when they settled on her, she felt as though he could see straight through to her soul. "Lady Kaela," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. "I am told you have come to propose marriage." There was no mockery in his tone, no hint of amusement at her audacity. If anything, he sounded tired, as though this was a conversation he had been dreading. "I have," she replied, grateful that her voice came out steady. "Though I suspect you know my circumstances already." She had no doubt that a man of his resources could have discovered everything there was to know about her and her brother before she had even reached his gates. He moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens below, and she noticed for the first time that his hands bore scars, old burns that had healed badly, leaving the skin twisted and discolored. "Your brother is accused of treason," he said without turning around. "The evidence against him is fabricated, but the king's justice rarely concerns itself with truth when it comes to those who question his policies." He spoke as though he had first-hand knowledge of such injustices, and she wondered what his own experiences with the king's justice might have been. "You can free him," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. "You have that power." She had heard enough stories about his influence to know that the king would not refuse a request from the Dark Sorcerer, not when that sorcerer stood between the kingdom and the chaotic magic of the borderlands. "I can," he agreed, finally turning to face her. "The question is whether you understand what you're offering in return." His gaze was intense, searching, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was looking for something specific in her response. "I understand that I'm offering myself as your wife," she said carefully. "I understand that this would be a marriage of convenience, not affection. I understand that I would be leaving my old life behind permanently." She paused, then added with an honesty that surprised her, "What I don't understand is why you would want such an arrangement. Surely you could have your pick of noble daughters if you wished to marry." Something flickered across his face at her words, too quick for her to interpret. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "I have no interest in noble daughters who come to me for political advantage. Perhaps I prefer the honesty of someone who admits she is making a bargain rather than pretending to feelings she does not possess." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of something that reminded her of winter mornings, clean and sharp and somehow comforting despite the strangeness of the situation. "Is that what you prefer?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "Honesty over pretense?" She had expected him to be pleased by her directness, but instead, he looked almost sad. "I prefer honesty because it is so rare," he said quietly. "Most people who approach me want something, and they are willing to lie, flatter, or manipulate to get it. You, at least, have been clear about your motivations from the beginning." He studied her face for a long moment, and she wondered what he saw there. "Very well, Lady Kaela. I accept your proposal. We will be married within the week, and your brother will be released before the ceremony takes place." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation that felt surreal in its normalcy. She was given rooms in the fortress that were more luxurious than anything she had ever experienced, with windows that looked out over the seemingly impossible gardens and furniture that spoke of wealth beyond her comprehension. Servants attended to her needs with the same professional courtesy she had encountered at the gates, and if they found anything strange about their master's choice of bride, they kept their opinions to themselves. The wedding dress that was provided for her was beautiful in its simplicity, made of silk the color of moonlight, and cut to flatter her figure without being ostentatious. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked like someone who belonged in this place, someone who might actually be worthy of the title she was about to assume. The ceremony itself was conducted in the fortress's chapel, a small room that managed to feel both sacred and intimate despite its modest size. There were no guests beyond the necessary witnesses, and the priest who officiated seemed more nervous than she was, stumbling over words he had probably spoken hundreds of times before. Lord Malric stood beside her throughout the proceedings, his presence both comforting and unsettling, and when the time came to exchange vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I, Malric of the Northern Marches, take thee, Kaela, to be my lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." The words were traditional, but there was something in the way he spoke them that made them feel like a promise rather than a mere formality. When it came time for her to repeat the vows, she found herself looking directly into his storm gray eyes, and the words came easier than she had expected. "I, Kaela, take thee, Malric, to be my lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." She meant them, she realized with surprise. Whatever this marriage might become, she was prepared to honor her commitment to it. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and chaste, but she felt a spark of something she hadn't anticipated, a warmth that had nothing to do with the transaction that had brought them together. When they parted, she saw something in his eyes that might have been surprise, as though he had felt it too. That evening, as she prepared for her first night as his wife, she found herself both nervous and curious about what would come next. The stories about Lord Malric had painted him as a figure of dark desire and dangerous appetites, but the man she had married seemed more complex than those tales suggested. He had been courteous throughout the day, even gentle, but there had been an underlying tension in his manner that spoke of carefully controlled emotions. When he came to her rooms that night, he paused in the doorway as though uncertain of his welcome. "May I come in?" he asked, and she was struck by the formality of the question. Everything about their arrangement had been negotiated and agreed upon, but he was still asking for her permission. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "This is your home, after all." She had changed into a nightgown that was both modest and becoming, another garment that had been provided for her without her asking. Whoever managed the household had anticipated her needs with remarkable accuracy. He moved to the window, much as he had done on the day of her arrival, and she noticed that he seemed more at ease looking out at the gardens than facing her directly. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I have no intention of forcing myself upon you. Our marriage may have been arranged for practical reasons, but I will not treat you as merely a possession to be used for my pleasure." He turned to face her then, and she saw that his expression was serious, almost grave. "If and when we share a bed, it will be because you want to, not because you feel obligated." The relief she felt at his words was so intense that she almost laughed. She had been prepared for much worse, had steeled herself for the possibility of brutality or indifference, but here was a man who was more concerned with her consent than his own desires. "Thank you," she said simply, and meant it more than she had meant almost anything in her life. "There is something else," he continued, and now he looked almost uncomfortable. "The stories you have heard about me, about what I am and what I do, they are mostly true. I am not a good man. Kaela, I have done things that would horrify you if you knew the details. I have killed, and I have used magic in ways that most people would consider abhorrent." He paused, as though gathering courage for what came next. "But I want you to know that I will never harm you, and I will never allow anyone else to harm you. You are under my protection now, and that protection extends to your brother as well." She studied his face, trying to understand what he was telling her. "Are you trying to frighten me?" she asked. "Or are you trying to prepare me for something?" She had the feeling that there was more to his confession than simple honesty, that he was testing her reaction to see how she would respond to the revelation of his true nature. "I am trying to be fair to you," he said. "You marry me to save your brother, but you deserve to know what kind of man you have bound yourself to. If you find that you cannot bear to be in my presence, I will make other arrangements. You will be provided for, and you will be safe, but you will not be required to play the role of wife if it becomes too difficult." The offer was made without any hint of self-pity or manipulation, simply a statement of fact. "And if I choose to stay?" she asked. "If I find that I can bear your presence after all?" She was surprised by her own boldness, but there was something about his honesty that invited equal frankness in return. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of hope that was quickly suppressed. "Then we will see what kind of marriage we can build together," he said quietly. "It may not be the conventional union that most people expect, but it could be something worthwhile nonetheless." She moved closer to him, drawn by an impulse she didn't fully understand. "May I ask you something?" she said, and when he nodded, she continued. "Why did you really want to marry? Not the political reasons or the practical considerations, but the real reason. What made you decide that you wanted a wife?" He was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low that she had to strain to hear him. "Because I am tired of being alone," he said. "Because I have spent years in this fortress, surrounded by people who serve me out of fear or duty, and I realized that I was slowly forgetting what it meant to be human." He looked at her directly then, and she saw vulnerability in his eyes that took her breath away. "I thought that perhaps if I had someone who chose to be here, someone who saw me as more than just a weapon or a monster, I might remember who I used to be before I became what I am now." The raw honesty of his admission hit her like a physical blow. She had expected calculation, manipulation, perhaps even cruelty, but not this lonely confession from a man who had clearly been carrying his isolation like a wound. "Who did you used to be?" she asked gently. "Before you became what you are now?" He smiled then, but it was a sad expression, full of grief for something lost. "I was a scholar," he said. "A younger son of a minor noble family, with no prospects beyond my education and my interest in the magical arts. I wanted to understand how magic worked, to push the boundaries of what was possible, to maybe even find ways to make it safer and more accessible to ordinary people. He moved to one of the bookshelves that lined the walls, running his fingers along the spines of the volumes there. I was idealistic, I suppose. I thought that knowledge could make the world better. What changed? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. War, he said simply. The king needed weapons, and magical weapons were more effective than conventional ones. I was recruited, along with several other young mages, to develop new forms of combat magic. We were told that our work would help end the conflict quickly, that fewer soldiers would die if we could give them better tools. He pulled one of the books from the shelf, a leather-bound volume that looked well read. We were very good at our work, too good perhaps. She waited, sensing that he needed time to find the words for what came next. The book in his hands was poetry, she realized, recognizing some of the verses from her own limited education. It seemed an unlikely choice for a man with his reputation, but then, everything about him was proving to be different from what she had expected. There was a battle, he continued eventually. A crucial engagement that could have determined the outcome of the entire war. I was sent to support the army with a spell of my own devising, something that was supposed to target only enemy combatants and leave our own bile. Forces untouched. His grip on the book tightened, and she saw his knuckles go white. It worked exactly as intended. The enemy forces were destroyed completely, not just killed but utterly obliterated. The problem was that I had been given false information about the enemy's position. End quote. She felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand what he was telling her. Your own forces, she said quietly. You hit your own forces. 300 men, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. 300 of our own soldiers, including the son of one of the kingdom's most powerful dukes. They died because I trusted the intelligence I was given, because I was too arrogant to question my orders, because I thought I was clever enough to create a weapon that could distinguish between friend and foe. End quote. He set the book down carefully, as though it might break. The official report blamed faulty intelligence and communication errors. I was quietly transferred to this posting, where I could be useful without being a political liability. The silence that followed his confession was heavy with implication. She began to understand now why he lived in such isolation, why he was feared even by those who nominally served alongside him. He wasn't just a powerful sorcerer, he was a man who had been betrayed by his own kingdom and forced to live with the consequences of that betrayal. They set you up, she said, the pieces falling into place. Someone wanted those soldiers dead, and they used you to do it. It was a horrible possibility, but it made more sense than the alternative, that a man of his obvious intelligence and caution would make such a catastrophic error by accident. I suspected as much, he admitted. But suspicion is not proof, and proof would not bring those men back to life. I am guilty of their deaths regardless of whether I was manipulated into causing them. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Does that change your opinion of me, knowing that I am responsible for the deaths of innocents? She considered the question seriously, weighing her response. The easy answer would be to recoil in horror, to see him as the monster the stories painted him as. But the man standing before her was clearly tormented by his actions, not proud of them. I think, she said slowly, that you have been carrying a burden that was never entirely yours to bear. And I think that the fact that you still feel guilt about what happened proves that you are not the monster you believe yourself to be. Something in his expression shifted, a subtle softening that suggested her words had affected him more than he wanted to admit. You are either very wise or very naive, he said, but there was no mockery in his voice. I am not certain which, but I find myself hoping it is the former. Why? She asked, genuinely curious about his answer. Because wisdom suggests that your judgment might be trusted, he said. And I find myself wanting very much to be worthy of your good opinion. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her, and she saw him retreat slightly, as though he had revealed more than he had intended. You have it, she said quietly. My good opinion, that is. You may have done terrible things, But you have also been honest with me about them. You could have hidden the truth, let me discover it gradually or not at all. Instead, you chose to tell me yourself, knowing that it might change how I see you." She moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. "That takes courage, and it suggests that you value honesty over self-preservation. Or it suggests that I am a fool," he said, but there was a hint of warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. A wise man would have kept his secrets and let his wife discover them slowly. If at all, a wise man would have, she agreed. But a good man would have done exactly what you did. She reached out, almost without thinking, and touched his hand. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, and she felt him start at the contact before he relaxed into it. "I think you are a better man than you believe yourself to be, Malric. And I think that perhaps that is what you need to remember most of all." He looked out at their joined hands, and she saw something in his expression that might have been wonder. "It has been a very long time since anyone has touched me without fear," he said quietly. "I had forgotten what it felt like." He lifted his gaze to meet hers, and she saw that his eyes were not as cold as she had first thought. There was warmth there, carefully hidden but unmistakably present. "Thank you, Kaela, for your honesty, for your courage, and for your willingness to see me as something more than the sum of my worst mistakes." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither of them had anticipated. She had come to this place expecting to make a sacrifice, to trade her freedom for her brother's life. But what she had found instead was a man who was as lonely and lost as she had been. The marriage that had begun as a transaction was already becoming something more complex, something that might actually have the potential to bring them both the companionship they had been missing. "Will you tell me about your brother?" he asked, breaking the spell that had settled over them. "I know the facts of his case, but I would like to know about him as a person. What kind of man inspires such loyalty from his sister?" She smiled, grateful for the change of subject, even as she felt a small pang of loss for the intimacy they had been sharing. "Finn is 3 years younger than I am, but he has always been the one with the clever ideas and the grand plans. When we were children, he was the one who convinced me to sneak out at night to catch fireflies, who taught me to climb trees and swim in the river when our parents weren't looking." She settled into a chair, and he took the seat across from her, his attention focused completely on her words. He has always seen the world as it could be rather than as it is, and he has never been able to understand why other people don't share his vision. "That sounds like a dangerous trait in the current political climate," he observed, and she nodded ruefully. "It is, but it's also what makes him special. He believes that people are fundamentally good, that most conflicts come from misunderstanding rather than malice, that problems can be solved through dialogue rather than violence." She paused, thinking about how to explain her brother's particular brand of idealism. He started distributing those pamphlets because he genuinely believed that if people understood the true cost of the war, they would demand peace. He didn't see it as treason, he saw it as education. "And now he is paying the price for that idealism," Malric said grimly. "The world has little patience for those who believe in the better angels of human nature." "No," she agreed, "but that doesn't make him wrong. It just makes him unlucky." She looked at him directly, seeing understanding in his eyes. "I think you understand what it's like to pay the price for believing in something, even when that belief proves to be misguided." "I do," he said quietly, "though I wonder if your brother's beliefs are truly misguided, or if they are simply ahead of their time. History has a way of vindicating idealists, even when their contemporaries condemn them." The conversation continued late into the night, ranging from personal histories to philosophical discussions about the nature of power and responsibility. She found herself genuinely engaged with his mind, impressed by his intelligence and his willingness to consider perspectives that differed from his own. When she finally retired to her bed, she was surprised to realize that she had enjoyed the evening, that she was looking forward to more such conversations in the future. Over the following weeks, she began to settle into her new life with an ease that surprised her. The fortress that had seemed so intimidating from the outside proved to be a comfortable home, filled with hidden gardens and quiet corners where she could read or think in peace. The servants treated her with respect that seemed genuine rather than merely professional, and she gradually began to understand the routines and rhythms of the household. Malric proved to be an attentive husband, though he maintained a careful distance that suggested he was still uncertain about the boundaries of their relationship. He made sure she had everything she needed, introduced her to the various people who helped manage his affairs, and included her in decisions about household matters in a way that made her feel like a true partner rather than merely a decorative addition to his life. Most evenings, they dined together and talked about their days, their conversations ranging from practical matters to discussions of books they had read or ideas they had encountered. She discovered that he had a sharp wit and a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, and she found herself laughing more than she had in months. He seemed to enjoy her company as well, though he was careful not to presume too much about her feelings or her willingness to expand their relationship beyond its current boundaries. It was during one of these evening conversations that she first noticed the way he held his left hand, keeping it slightly turned away from her view. She had observed the scars on his hands before, but now she realized that he was deliberately concealing them, as though he was ashamed of their appearance. When she asked about them, he deflected the question with a skill that suggested he had done so many times before. "They are old injuries," he said simply. "Nothing that needs to concern you." But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke about them, and she suspected that there was more to the story than he was willing to share. It was while exploring the fortress one afternoon that she discovered the greenhouse, a structure that had been hidden from her view by the main building's architecture. The glass walls were fogged with condensation, and when she stepped inside, she was greeted by a wave of humid air that smelled of growing things and rich earth. The space was filled with plants she didn't recognize, exotic species that seemed to thrive in the controlled environment. And at the center of it all was a small seating area where someone had clearly spent considerable time. "I wondered when you would find this place." Malric's voice came from behind her, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I should have shown it to you myself, but I wasn't certain you would be interested." "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it completely. The greenhouse was clearly a labor of love, tended with the kind of care that spoke of genuine passion for the work. "Did you create all of this yourself?" "Most of it," he admitted, moving to join her among the plants. "Gardening is not typically considered an appropriate hobby for someone in my position, but I find it peaceful. There is something satisfying about nurturing growth, about creating life rather than destroying it." He reached out to touch one of the flowers, a delicate bloom in a shade of blue she had never seen before. "These plants come from all over the world. I've been collecting them for years, learning about their needs and their properties." She watched him as he moved among the plants, noting the gentleness of his touch and the obvious affection in his voice when he spoke about them. This was a side of him that she had glimpsed in their conversations but never seen so clearly displayed. The scholar and the dreamer who had existed before the war had changed him into something harder and more dangerous. "This is who you really are," she said softly, and he looked at her with surprise. "Not the Dark Sorcerer or the King's weapon, but this. Someone who loves beautiful things and wants to help them grow." She moved closer to him, drawn by the vulnerability she saw in his expression. "Why do you hide this part of yourself?" "Because it is a weakness," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Because people like me are not supposed to have gentle interests or care about things that serve no practical purpose. Because—" He trailed off, as though he couldn't find the words for what he wanted to say. "Because it makes you human," she finished for him. "Because it proves that you are not the monster they want you to be." She reached out and touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "There is no shame in being human, Malric. There is no shame in caring about life and growth and beauty." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a wall coming down that had been in place for so long but its absence was almost startling. "I had not shared this place with anyone," he said quietly. "I was not certain that anyone would understand." "I understand," she assured him. "And I think it's wonderful that you have created something so beautiful in a world that seems determined to destroy everything good and gentle." She looked around the greenhouse again, seeing it with new eyes now that she understood its significance. Would you teach me about them? The plants, I mean. I would like to learn. The smile that spread across his face was radiant, transforming his features in a way that made her heart skip. I would like that very much, he said, and she could hear the genuine pleasure in his voice. There is so much to share, so many stories about where they come from and how they grow. I have been collecting notes and observations for years, but I have never had anyone to share them with. From that day forward, she spent part of each afternoon in the greenhouse with him, learning about the plants and their care while he shared stories about his travels and the places he had visited in search of new specimens. She discovered that he had a gift for teaching, a patience and enthusiasm that made even the most complex botanical concepts accessible to her untrained mind. More importantly, she saw him relax in a way that he never did in the main part of the fortress, his carefully maintained composure giving way to something more natural and unguarded. It was during one of these afternoons that she finally gathered the courage to ask about his scars. They were working together to repot a particularly delicate orchid, and she noticed again how he favored his right hand, keeping his left partially hidden from her view. The burns were clearly old, but they were extensive, covering not just his hand but extending up his forearm in patterns that suggested they had been caused by something other than ordinary fire. Malric, she said gently, not wanting to startle him. May I ask about your scars? I don't mean to pry, but I've noticed that you seem self-conscious about them, and I want you to know that they don't bother me. She paused, searching for the right words. I've seen enough of life to know that everyone carries marks from their experiences. Yours just happened to be visible. His hand stilled on the orchid, and for a moment she thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, as though he were reciting facts rather than sharing personal history. They are from the spell that killed those soldiers, he said. Magic of that magnitude requires a physical focus, a way to channel the energy safely. The burns are the price I paid for wielding power beyond what my body could naturally contain. He flexed his fingers, and she could see the way the scar tissue pulled and stretched. They serve as a reminder of what happens when I trust too easily, when I allow myself to be used as a weapon without questioning the target. She reached out without thinking, her fingers hovering just above his scarred hand. May I? She asked, and when he nodded, she gently took his hand in both of hers, turning it so she could see the full extent of the damage. The burns were indeed extensive, but they were also old and well-healed, and she could see that someone had taken great care in treating them to minimize the functional impairment. They don't look like punishment, she said thoughtfully. They look like sacrifice, like the price someone pays for trying to do what they believe is right, even when it costs them dearly. She traced one of the scars with her fingertip, feeling the way the tissue was different from the surrounding skin. You could have refused the assignment, couldn't you? Could have claimed that the magic was too dangerous, or that you weren't ready for such a powerful spell. I could have, he agreed, his voice softer now. But I believed that my abilities could make a difference, but I could help end the war more quickly and save lives in the process. I was proud of my skills and eager to prove that I was worthy of the trust that had been placed in me. He looked down at their joined hands, and she saw something that might have been wonder in his expression. I have not let anyone touch them since the healers finished their work. I thought they were too ugly, too much of a reminder of my failures. They are not ugly, she said firmly. They are part of you, part of your story. And your story is not one of failure. It is one of someone who was willing to sacrifice himself for what he believed was right, even when that belief proved to be misguided. She lifted his hand to her lips and pressed a gentle kiss to one of the scars, feeling him go very still at the contact. They are proof that you are capable of great love, even if that love was betrayed. The silence that followed was charged with emotion, and she could feel something fundamental shifting between them. The careful distance they had maintained was dissolving, replaced by something more intimate and more dangerous. When she looked up at him, she saw heat in his eyes that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the man beneath the sorcerer's reputation. Kaela, he said, her name a whisper that seemed to carry all the longing he had been carefully suppressing. I am not certain I am the man you seem to think I am. I am not certain I am capable of being that man. You already are that man, she said, moving closer to him until there was barely any space between them. You have been kind to me, patient with my questions, generous with your time and your knowledge. You have shown me parts of yourself that you keep hidden from everyone else, and you have done it without asking for anything in return. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the slight roughness of his beard beneath her palm. What more could I ask for in a husband? You could ask for love, he said, his voice barely audible. You can ask for someone who chose you for yourself rather than for the honesty of your bargain. You can ask for someone who is not carrying the weight of so many regrets. I could, she agreed. But I think I would rather have someone who is honest about his regrets than someone who pretends to have none. I think I would rather have someone who values honesty enough to offer it freely than someone who speaks of love but means something else entirely. She paused, gathering her courage for what she wanted to say next. And I think I would rather have someone who is capable of growing into love than someone who claims to feel it immediately. Growing into love, he repeated, as though the phrase was foreign to him. Do you think such a thing is possible? Can two people who began as strangers, who married for practical reasons, truly come to care for each other? I think, she said carefully, that we may already be further along that path than either of us realized. I think that what I feel for you now is not the same as what I felt on our wedding day, and I think that what you feel for me has changed as well. She took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything between them. I think that I am beginning to fall in love with you, Malric, and I think that you are beginning to fall in love with me. The confession hung in the air between them, and she watched as he processed her words, his expression cycling through surprise, hope, and something that might have been fear. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I had not dared to hope, he said. I had not dared to believe that what I was feeling was mutual. I had been alone for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to want someone's company, to look forward to seeing them, to find excuses to spend time in their presence. He cupped her face in his hands, his scarred fingers gentle against her skin. I am falling in love with you, Kaela. I have been falling in love with you since the first night we talked, when you saw past my reputation to the man beneath. Then why are we still standing here talking? She asked, a smile, tugging at her lips. Why are we not celebrating this discovery? His answer was to kiss her, and she felt the last of her reservations dissolve at the contact. This was not the chaste kiss of their wedding ceremony, but something deeper and more urgent, a claiming that spoke to the passion that had been building between them for weeks. She melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with equal fervor, tasting the sweetness of his mouth and the promise of what was to come. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and she could see the fire in his eyes that matched the heat coursing through her own veins. Perhaps, he said, his voice husky with desire, we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. Perhaps we should. She agreed, and let him lead her from the greenhouse back to the main part of the fortress, her heart racing with anticipation and a joy she had never expected to feel. That night they came together as husband and wife in truth, not just in name. He was gentle with her, patient and considerate, making sure that her pleasure came before his own. She had expected competence, perhaps even skill, but what she found was reverence. A man who seemed to worship her with his hands and his mouth as though she were something precious and rare. Afterward, as they lay entwined in his bed, she traced patterns on his chest with her fingertips, marveling at the sense of rightness she felt in his arms. I never expected this, she said softly. When I came here, I thought I was making a sacrifice. I never imagined that I might find happiness instead. Nor did I, he murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I thought I was making a practical arrangement, acquiring a wife who would provide companionship and perhaps eventually children. I never imagined that I might find someone who could see past my reputation to the, quote, man I used to be. Someone who could help me remember what it felt like to be human. And now? She asked, tilting her head to look at him. Now I find myself hoping for things I had not dared to want, he said. A true marriage, A partnership built on mutual respect and affection. Perhaps even a family someday, if we are blessed with children. He smiled at her, and she saw happiness in his expression that transformed his features. I find myself hoping for a future that includes laughter and shared dreams, and the kind of love that grows stronger with time. I hope for those things too, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. I hope for a life where we can be ourselves with each other, where we can build something beautiful together despite the circumstances that brought us to this point. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of her life. She and Malric fell into a routine that included their work in the greenhouse, their evening conversations, and their growing intimacy as husband and wife. She began to understand the complexities of his position, the delicate balance he maintained between serving the kingdom and protecting his own interests. And she found herself becoming a true partner in his efforts to navigate the political currents that swirled around them. It was during this period of contentment that the first signs of trouble began to appear. Messengers arrived at the fortress with increasing frequency, bearing news from the capital that grew more disturbing with each report. The war in the north was going badly, and there were rumors of unrest in the southern provinces as well. The king was demanding more resources, more soldiers, more magical support from those who possess such abilities. "He wants me to return to active service," Malric told her one evening, his expression grim as he set aside the latest dispatch. "There has been a major defeat, and the army is in retreat. The king believes that my particular talents are needed to turn the tide of battle." He looked at her with eyes that held a familiar weight of responsibility and regret. "I have been summoned to court to discuss my redeployment." The news hit her like a physical blow, though she tried to hide her reaction. She had known that their peaceful existence could not last forever, that the world outside their fortress walls would eventually intrude upon their happiness. But she had hoped for more time, more opportunity to build their relationship on a foundation that could withstand the pressures of his public role. "Will you go?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I must," he said simply. "I serve at the pleasure of the crown, and my oath of fealty is not something I can simply set aside when it becomes inconvenient. But I will not go without ensuring that you are protected in my absence." He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I have been thinking about what precautions to take, what arrangements to make for your safety." "I could come with you," she suggested, though she knew even as she spoke that it was not a realistic possibility. "I could stay in the capital while you attend to your duties, and we could see each other between your assignments." He shook his head, his expression gentle but firm. "The capital is not safe for someone in your position. There are too many people who would see you as a weakness they could exploit. Too many who would seek to use you as leverage against me. You are safer here, where my reputation protects you, and where the household staff are loyal to me personally, rather than to the crown." She knew he was right, but the prospect of separation filled her with dread. They had only just found each other, had only just begun to build the kind of relationship she had never dared to hope for. The thought of losing him now, when they had so much to look forward to, was almost unbearable. "How long will you be gone?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I do not know," he admitted. "It depends on what the king requires, on how quickly the situation can be resolved. It could be weeks, or it could be months. I will send word when I can, but communication from the front lines is often unreliable." He squeezed her hand, and she could feel the tension in his grip. "I want you to know that I will come back to you, Kaela. Whatever happens, whatever I am asked to do, I will find a way to return to this place, and to the life we are building together. Promise me," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "Promise me that you will not let them turn you back into the weapon you used to be. Promise me that you will remember who you are now, not just who you were before we met." "I promise," he said, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "I promise that I will hold on to what we have built together, but I will let it anchor me when the world tries to pull me back into darkness. I promise that I will come back to you as the man you fell in love with, not as the monster they want me to be." The night before his departure, they made love with a passion that bordered on desperation, as though they could store up enough intimacy to sustain them through the separation to come. She memorized the feel of his hands on her skin, the sound of his voice when he whispered her name, the way he looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in his world. "I love you," she told him as they lay together in the darkness, her head on his chest and his arms wrapped around her. "I love you, and I will be here waiting for you when you return." "I love you too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible, more than I ever believed I deserved. You have given me a reason to come home, Kaela, and I will not waste that gift." He left at dawn, riding out with a small escort toward the capital, and she watched from the tower window until he disappeared beyond the horizon. The fortress felt empty without him, despite the presence of the household staff who continued their duties with the same efficiency they had always shown. She threw herself into maintaining the greenhouse, tending to the plants they had cared for together, and adding new specimens to the collection as a way of keeping busy. The first weeks of his absence passed slowly, marked by the arrival of brief letters that told her little about his activities, but assured her that he was safe and thinking of her. She treasured these communications, reading them over and over until she had memorized every word, every loop of his handwriting that connected her to the man she missed so desperately. It was during the second month of his absence that she began to notice changes in the household staff. Conversations ceased when she entered rooms, and there were hushed conferences between the senior servants that excluded her entirely. She might have dismissed these changes as normal variations in routine, but there was something in the way people looked at her now that suggested they knew something she did not. Her suspicions were confirmed when she discovered the steward burning papers in the fireplace of his office, documents that he attempted to shield from her view when she entered the room. When she asked about them, he gave her an evasive answer about routine correspondence, but she could see the tension in his manner that suggested he was hiding something significant. That night she searched his office when the household was asleep, using skills she had learned as a child when necessity had required her to be resourceful in ways that were not entirely legal. What she found among the papers he had not yet destroyed chilled her to the bone. The documents were reports from the capital, written in a code that was simple enough for her to decipher once she understood the pattern. They described Malric's activities in detail, including his reluctance to employ the kinds of magical weapons that had made him famous, his requests for more conventional assignments, and his apparent unwillingness to embrace the role of destroyer that the king required. More disturbing still were the notes about contingency plans, discussions of what actions to take if the Dark Sorcerer proved to be unreliable, or if his loyalty to the crown came into question. There were references to his weakness, his newfound attachment to his wife, and the ways in which that attachment might be exploited to ensure his compliance with royal orders. She was not mentioned by name in the documents, but the implications were clear enough. She was seen as a liability, a softening influence that had made her husband less effective as a weapon. There were suggestions that her removal might be necessary if other methods of ensuring his cooperation proved inadequate. The realization that she had become a target, that her very existence was seen as a threat to the kingdom's military interests, filled her with a cold fury that she had never experienced before. She had entered into this marriage to save her brother, but she had found love instead, and now that love was being used against both her and her husband. She spent the rest of the night planning, drawing on the same determination that had brought her to Malric's fortress in the first place. If the king's agents saw her as a weakness to be exploited, then she would prove them wrong. If they believed that she was simply a helpless woman who could be used as leverage, then they would discover that they had seriously underestimated her capabilities. The next morning, she began to implement her plan. She approached the household staff with a series of requests that seemed innocuous on the surface, but were actually designed to identify who among them could be trusted and who might be reporting to outside authorities. She discovered that the steward and 2 of the guards were indeed in the pay of the king's intelligence services, but that the majority of the staff remained loyal to Malric personally. Armed with this knowledge, she began to create a network of information and support that will allow her to protect herself and, by extension, her husband. She reached out to contacts in the nearby villages, people who owed favors to Malric or who had benefited from his protection over the years. She arranged for messages to be sent through channels that bypassed the official communication systems, creating a way to stay in contact with her husband that would not be monitored by those who sought to use their relationship against them. Most importantly, she began to prepare for the possibility that she might need to leave the fortress, either to escape immediate danger or to actively work against those who threatened her husband. She gathered resources, identified safe houses, and established contingency plans that would allow her to operate independently if necessary. It was while she was engaged in these preparations that she received the letter that changed everything. It came through one of her new communication channels, written in Malric's hand but bearing news that made her blood run cold. He had been given an ultimatum by the king: employ his most devastating magical weapons against the enemy forces, or face charges of treason that would result in his execution and the confiscation of all his properties. The letter went on to explain that the king had grown tired of his reluctance to embrace his role as a destroyer, tired of his requests for more conventional assignments that did not require him to unleash the kind of magical devastation that had made him famous. There had been too many defeats, too many losses that might have been prevented if the Dark Sorcerer had been willing to do what was necessary. I find myself in an impossible position, he wrote. If I comply with the king's demands, I will become once again the weapon I swore I would never be. If I refuse, I will be branded a traitor and executed, and you will be left defenseless against those who see you as a threat to the kingdom's interests. I cannot bear the thought of either outcome, but I see no third option that would allow us both to survive. The letter concluded with instructions for her to flee the fortress immediately, to use the resources he had provided to establish a new life far from the kingdom's borders. He would find a way to join her eventually, he promised, but for now, her safety was more important than their happiness. She read the letter 3 times, each reading filling her with a different emotion. First came fear, the natural response to learning that her life was in danger. Then came anger, fury at the king and his agents for putting her husband in such an impossible position. Finally came determination, a cold resolve that surprised her with its intensity. She would not run. She would not abandon her husband to face this crisis alone. And she would not allow the king to turn the man she loved back into the weapon he had been before they met. Instead, she would fight. She would use every resource at her disposal, every skill she had learned, every alliance she had forged, to find a way to save both her husband and their marriage. She would prove that love was not a weakness to be exploited, but a strength that could overcome even the most impossible odds. The plan that formed in her mind was audacious and dangerous, requiring her to leave the relative safety of the fortress and venture into the heart of enemy territory. She would go to the capital, not as the helpless wife of the Dark Sorcerer, but as an agent working to expose the corruption and betrayal that had put her husband in this position. She had pieced together enough information from the documents she had found to understand that Malric's original disgrace had been orchestrated by someone with access to high-level military intelligence. The false information that had led to the destruction of his own forces had not been an accident or a simple mistake, but a deliberate act of sabotage designed to remove him from positions of influence while still keeping him available as a weapon. If she could identify the person responsible for that betrayal, if she could gather proof of their involvement, she might be able to clear her husband's name and free him from the impossible choice he currently faced. It would require her to operate in shadows, to take risks that could cost her life, but she was prepared for that possibility. She began her preparations immediately, gathering the resources she would need for the journey and the investigation to come. She said goodbye to the greenhouse and the plants they had tended together, promising them that she would return to care for them once this crisis was resolved. She left detailed instructions for the loyal members of the household staff, ensuring that the fortress would be maintained in her absence. Most importantly, she wrote a letter to her husband, explaining her intentions and her reasons for taking this course of action. She could not tell him the specifics of her plan, could not risk the communication being intercepted, but she could tell him that she loved him and that she was not willing to give up on their future together. "You once told me that love was not a weakness," she wrote. "You are right. Love is the strength that allows us to sacrifice for each other, to fight for each other, to refuse to accept defeat when the stakes are too high. I love you, Malric, and I will not let them destroy what we have built together. Trust me, and know that I will find a way to bring you home." She left the fortress before dawn, traveling in disguise and using routes that would avoid the main roads where she might be recognized. The journey to the capital took her nearly a week, but she used the time to refine her plan and to prepare for the dangerous game she was about to play. The capital was a maze of narrow streets and tall buildings, filled with people from every level of society. She established herself in a modest inn in a district that catered to merchants and travelers, choosing a location that would allow her to blend in while still giving her access to the information she needed. Her first task was to identify the key players in the conspiracy that had destroyed her husband's career. She had names from the documents she had found, but she needed to understand the current power structure to determine who was still in positions of influence and who might be vulnerable to pressure or persuasion. She spent days in taverns and markets, listening to gossip and rumors, piecing together the complex web of relationships that governed the kingdom's military and political establishment. She learned about promotions and demotions, about alliances and rivalries, about the various factions that competed for the king's favor. Gradually, a picture began to emerge. The conspiracy had been led by a group of mid-level officers who had seen Malric's growing influence as a threat to their own advancement. They had arranged for him to receive false intelligence, knowing that his sense of duty would compel him to use his most powerful magic without questioning the accuracy of the information. The plan had worked perfectly from their perspective. Malric had been removed from positions of influence but had remained available as a weapon when needed. The officers involved had been promoted to fill the vacuum left by his disgrace, and they had spent the intervening years consolidating their power and influence. Now, however, the situation had changed. The war was going badly, and the king was demanding results that conventional methods could not provide. The conspirators found themselves in the position of having to use the very weapon they had helped to create, but they were discovering that the weapon was no longer as reliable as they had assumed. Malric's marriage had indeed changed him, had given him reasons to question orders and to seek alternatives to the wholesale destruction that had once been his specialty. This change was seen as a liability by those who had orchestrated his downfall, and they were now seeking ways to restore him to his former effectiveness. The plan to use his wife as leverage was just the beginning. If that proved insufficient, they were prepared to take more drastic action, including the possibility of arranging an accident. That would remove the softening influence permanently, while providing the Dark Sorcerer with a new source of rage and hatred to fuel his magic. The discovery of this additional threat filled her with a renewed sense of urgency. She was not just fighting for her husband's freedom, she was fighting for both their lives. The conspirators would not be satisfied with simply restoring Malric to his former role. They would eliminate any obstacle to their control over him. She began to gather evidence, using her skills of observation and deduction to identify the specific individuals involved and to document their actions. She cultivated relationships with servants and clerks who had access to sensitive information, offering small bribes and favors in exchange for copies of documents or reports of private conversations. The work was dangerous and exhausting, requiring her to maintain her cover while simultaneously conducting a complex investigation. She had to be careful not to attract attention to herself, to avoid the notice of those who might recognize her as the Dark Sorcerer's wife. At the same time, she had to move quickly, knowing that time was running out for her husband. It was during the third week of her investigation that she finally found the proof she needed. A careless conversation between two of the conspirators, overheard by a servant she had befriended, provided the missing piece of the puzzle. The false intelligence that had led to Malric's disgrace had been deliberately fabricated by the same officers who were now seeking to control him. More importantly, she learned that the conspiracy extended beyond the military to include members of the royal court itself. The king was not personally involved, but several of his advisors had been complicit in the plan, seeing it as a way to maintain control over the kingdom's most powerful magical weapon. Armed with this information, she began to plan her next move. She could not simply present her evidence to the king. Too many of his advisors were compromised, and there was no guarantee that the information would reach him without being suppressed. Instead, she would need to find a way to expose the conspiracy publicly, to force the king to act by making the truth impossible to ignore. The plan she developed was risky and required precise timing, but it offered the best chance of success. She would arrange for the evidence to be presented during a public ceremony, in front of witnesses who could not be silenced or intimidated. The king would be forced to respond to the accusations, and the conspirators would find themselves exposed and vulnerable. She spent several days preparing for the event, arranging for the evidence to be delivered to key individuals at exactly the right moment. She also prepared contingency plans in case the primary strategy failed, knowing that she would likely have only one chance to succeed. The day of the ceremony arrived with unseasonable warmth, as though the weather itself was conspiring to make her plan more difficult. She positioned herself among the crowd of spectators, watching as the various dignitaries took their places on the platform. Her heart was racing, but her hands were steady as she prepared to set her plan in motion. At the precise moment she had calculated, she gave the signal that would trigger the delivery of the evidence. Documents were distributed to key members of the audience, each packet containing proof of the conspiracy and the names of those involved. The reaction was immediate and dramatic, as the recipients began to understand the implications of what they were reading. The king himself received the most damaging evidence, a detailed account of how his own advisors had manipulated him into believing that Malric's disgrace was the result of incompetence rather than sabotage. The documents showed clearly that the Dark Sorcerer had been betrayed by those who should have been his allies, and that his subsequent isolation had been orchestrated by the very people who now sought to control him. The king's reaction was swift and decisive. He called for the immediate arrest of the conspirators, ordering a full investigation into their activities. He also issued a public pardon for Malric, acknowledging that the charges against him had been based on false information, and that he had been wrongly accused of negligence. The vindication was everything she had hoped for, but it came with a price. Her role in exposing the conspiracy had been discovered, and she found herself the target of those who had managed to escape immediate arrest. She was forced to flee the capital, using the same skills and resources that had brought her there to make her escape. The journey back to the fortress was harrowing, marked by several close encounters with agents who sought to capture her before she could reach the safety of her home. She traveled by night and hid during the day, using every trick she had learned to avoid detection. By the time she reached the familiar walls of the fortress, she was exhausted and emotionally drained, but she was alive, and she had succeeded in her mission. The fortress was in chaos when she arrived, with messengers coming and going at all hours, as news of the king's actions spread throughout the kingdom. She learned that Malric had been recalled from the front lines, and was expected to return within days, his reputation restored and his position secure. When he finally arrived, riding through the gates with an escort of royal guards who had been assigned to ensure his safe return, she was waiting for him in the courtyard. The reunion was everything she had dreamed of during their separation, fierce and passionate and filled with the joy of two people who had found each other again, against impossible odds. "I cannot believe what you did," he said, holding her tightly against him as though he feared she might disappear if he let her go. "When I received word of what had happened in the capital, I could hardly believe that you had managed to expose the conspiracy and clear my name. The risks you took, the dangers you faced, it was beyond anything I had imagined possible." "I told you that love was not a weakness," she replied, pulling back to look at him. "I told you that I would not let them destroy what we had built together. I meant every word of it, Malric. I was not going to lose you to their scheming and manipulation." "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If they had caught you, if they had realized what you were doing, they would have eliminated you without a second thought. I would have lost you, and I would have been powerless to prevent it. But they did not catch me," she said firmly. "And now we are both free, both safe, both able to build the life we want together. The conspiracy has been exposed, the conspirators have been arrested, and you are no longer under suspicion of treason. We have won, Malric. We have won the right to be happy together." He kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of relief and joy, and the promise of a future that was finally theirs to shape. When they finally broke apart, she saw tears in his eyes, tears of happiness and gratitude and love so profound that it took her breath away. "I love you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love you more than life itself, more than I ever believed it was possible to love another person. You have saved me, Kaela, not just from the king's justice but from the darkness that was consuming me. You have given me back my humanity, my hope, my reason for living. And you have given me a love I never dared to dream of, she replied. A partnership that is based on mutual respect and genuine affection. A marriage that is real in every sense of the word. We have both been saved, my darling. We have both been given a second chance at happiness. The weeks that followed were a time of healing and rebuilding, as they worked to restore their relationship and to create the life they had envisioned together. The fortress was no longer a place of exile, but a true home, filled with laughter and love and the promise of a future that belonged to them alone. They returned to their work in the greenhouse, tending to the plants that had waited patiently for their return. They resumed their evening conversations, sharing their thoughts and dreams and plans for the years to come. They made love with a passion that was deeper and more meaningful than ever before, their physical connection strengthened by the emotional bond they had forged through their trials. Most importantly, they began to plan for the family they both wanted, the children who would grow up in a world where their parents' love was not a weakness to be exploited but a strength to be celebrated. They spoke of names and nurseries, of the values they would teach and the dreams they would encourage. The kingdom's political situation stabilized as the new military leadership proved to be more competent and less corrupt than their predecessors. The war in the north was concluded through negotiation rather than magical devastation, and the southern provinces were pacified through diplomatic means rather than military force. Malric's skills were still called upon from time to time, but he was no longer expected to serve as the kingdom's primary weapon of mass destruction. Instead, he was able to return to his earlier interests, using his magical abilities to support peaceful endeavors rather than military ones. He worked with farmers to improve crop yields, with healers to develop new medical treatments, with scholars to advance the understanding of magical theory. He became the kind of mage he had always wanted to be, using his gifts to help rather than to harm. Their first child was born on the spring morning when the greenhouse was filled with the fragrance of blooming flowers. She was a daughter, small and perfect and bearing her father's storm-gray eyes and her mother's determined chin. They named her Hope, because she represented everything they had fought for and everything they had won. As Kaela held her daughter in her arms, looking out at the gardens that had become a symbol of their love's ability to create beauty from darkness, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come to this place as a desperate woman seeking to save her brother, willing to sacrifice herself for his freedom. She had found instead a man who was as lonely and lost as she had been, and together they had built something beautiful and strong and lasting. The marriage that had begun as a transaction had become a true partnership, a union based on mutual love and respect and genuine affection. They had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, not through luck or chance but through their willingness to fight for each other and for the future they wanted to share. Her brother Finn had been pardoned along with Malric, his own charges dismissed as part of the broader investigation into the conspiracy. He had come to visit them several times, marveling at his sister's transformation from a desperate woman into a confident and capable lady. He had also become friends with Malric, finding in him a kindred spirit who shared his belief that peace was preferable to war and that understanding was more valuable than victory. "I cannot believe how everything turned out," Finn said during one of his visits, watching as Kaela played with her daughter in the garden. "When you first told me you were going to marry the Dark Sorcerer, I thought I was losing my sister forever. I thought you were sacrificing yourself for my sake, and I felt terrible about it." "I thought I was sacrificing myself too," Kaela admitted, bouncing Hope on her knee and smiling at her gurgling laughter. "I had no idea that I would find love instead, or that the man everyone feared would turn out to be someone who needed love as much as I did. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as sacrifices." Malric emerged from the greenhouse at that moment, his hands dirty from repotting and his face relaxed in a way that would have been unimaginable to those who knew only his reputation. He had been working with a new species of flowering vine that showed promise for medicinal applications, and his excitement about the project was evident in every line of his body. "The Healers Guild has agreed to fund a full study of the crimson bellflower," he announced, settling beside his wife and daughter on the garden bench. "If our preliminary results are confirmed, we may have found a treatment for the wasting sickness that has plagued the eastern provinces." He reached out to stroke Hope's downy hair, his expression softening even further as she grabbed his finger with her tiny fist. "That's wonderful news," Kaela said, leaning against his shoulder and feeling the familiar warmth of contentment that came from these quiet family moments. "How long do you think the study will take?" "Perhaps 2 years for the full trials," he replied, wrapping his free arm around her waist. "But the preliminary work can be done here, in our own greenhouse. I have already begun designing the controlled environment they will need to thrive in larger quantities." He paused, his gaze shifting between his wife and daughter. "It will be good work, meaningful work, the kind of magical research I always dreamed of doing when I was young and idealistic." Finn watched this domestic scene with obvious satisfaction, remembering the broken man his sister had been when she first proposed her desperate bargain. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think this might be the happiest ending anyone could have imagined. You saved my life, Kaela, but in doing so, you also saved his, and he saved yours right back. We saved each other," Kaela corrected gently. "That's what love does. It doesn't make you weak or vulnerable, despite what some people think. It makes you stronger because you have something worth fighting for, someone worth becoming better for." She looked up at her husband, seeing the man who had learned to trust again, who had remembered how to hope for the future. "We made each other braver than we ever were alone." The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the garden and filling the air with the golden glow that came just before sunset. Hope had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, her tiny face peaceful and perfect, and the adults lowered their voices to avoid disturbing her rest. "Have you given any thought to what you'll tell her when she's older?" Finn asked quietly. "About how you met? About the circumstances that brought you together?" Malric and Kaela exchanged a look that spoke of conversations they had already had about this very question. "We'll tell her the truth," Malric said eventually. "We'll tell her that sometimes people meet under difficult circumstances, but that doesn't make their love any less real or valuable. We'll tell her that our mother was the bravest person I ever knew, and that she taught me what it meant to choose love over fear. We'll tell her that love is worth fighting for," Kaela added. "That sometimes you have to be willing to risk everything to protect the people you care about, but that the risk is always worthwhile when the alternative is losing them forever." She adjusted her hold on the sleeping baby, marveling at the weight of this small person who represented so much hope and promise. "We'll tell her that she was wanted and loved before she was even born, and that she comes from a long line of people who believe in doing what's right even when it's difficult." As evening approached, they moved inside for dinner, continuing their conversation over a meal that had been prepared by the household staff who had become like family over the years. The fortress that had once seemed so intimidating and isolated now felt warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation and the comfortable rhythms of daily life. After Finn retired to his guest quarters for the night, Malric and Kaela sat together in their private sitting room, Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with books and artwork that reflected their shared interests and experiences. "Do you ever regret it?" Malric asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you had made different choices that day in the dungeon?" Kaela considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked something that touched on the fundamental nature of their relationship. "I think about alternate possibilities sometimes," she said honestly. "I wonder if Finn and I might have found another way to secure his freedom, or if I might have found love with someone under more conventional circumstances." She paused, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "But I don't regret the choices I made. How could I regret the path that led me to you, to this life we've built together, to our daughter, even though it meant leaving behind everything familiar?" he pressed gently. "Even though it meant taking such enormous risks with your own safety and happiness?" "Especially because of that," she said firmly. "The familiar wasn't making me happy, Malric. I was existing, surviving, protecting the people I loved, but I wasn't truly living. I wasn't growing or learning or becoming the person I was meant to be." She moved closer to him on the sofa, taking his scarred hand in both of hers. "You gave me the chance to become someone I never knew I could be. You gave me the chance to be brave and clever and strong in ways I had never imagined. You were already all of those things, he said, bringing her hand to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. I simply provided the circumstances that allowed you to discover them. And you did the same for me, helping me remember that I was more than just a weapon, more than just the sum of my worst mistakes. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching their daughter sleep and reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. The storms that had threatened to destroy them both had passed, leaving behind a landscape that was more beautiful for having been tested and proven strong. I have something for you, Malric said eventually, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small wrapped package. I've been working on it for weeks, waiting for the right moment to give it to you. Intrigued, Kaela unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a delicate silver locket that had been engraved with an intricate pattern of vines and flowers. When she opened it, she found tiny portraits inside, painted with extraordinary skill and attention to detail. One showed her own face, captured with loving accuracy, while the other showed their daughter as she appeared now, sleeping peacefully with her tiny fist curled near her cheek. It's beautiful, she breathed, turning the locket to catch the firelight. Did you paint these yourself? I did, he admitted, looking almost shy about his artistic efforts. I wanted you to have something that would remind you of this time, of how perfect everything feels right now. I know that life will bring challenges and changes, that we'll face difficulties and sorrows as well as joys, but I wanted to capture this moment when everything is exactly as it should be. She fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her skin like a promise. I love it, she said simply, and I love you, more than I can ever find words to express. You have given me everything I never dared to dream of, and I wake up every morning grateful for the miracle of this life we've created together. And I love you, he replied, pulling her close for a kiss that tasted of contentment and promise, and the deep satisfaction that came from knowing they had found their way home to each other. My brave, brilliant, beautiful wife. My partner in everything that matters. The mother of my children, and the keeper of my heart. The kiss deepened, and she felt the familiar spark of desire that still flared between them whenever they touched. Even now, months after their daughter's birth, the passion that had grown between them remained as strong as ever, perhaps even stronger for having been tested by separation and danger and the ordinary challenges of daily life. The baby, she murmured against his lips, glancing toward the cradle where Hope continued to sleep peacefully, is fast asleep, he finished for her, his voice husky with want. And will likely remain so for several hours, if past experience is any guide. He stood and offered her his hand, the same gesture he had made on their wedding night, when they had first begun to discover what they might mean to each other. Come to bed with me, wife. Let me show you again how much I treasure what we have built together. She took his hand without hesitation, following him to their bedchamber where they came together with the passion of lovers and the tenderness of partners who had learned to trust each other completely. Their lovemaking was both fierce and gentle, urgent and patient, a physical expression of the emotional bond that had sustained them through every trial they had faced. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, she traced lazy patterns on his chest and reflected on how much her life had changed since that desperate day when she had first approached his fortress. She had come seeking to save her brother, willing to sacrifice her own happiness for his freedom. What she had found instead was a love so profound and transformative that it had changed the very essence of who she was. What are you thinking about? He asked softly, his fingers combing through her hair in the gentle, repetitive motion that always soothed her. About transformations, she said, tilting her head to look at him in the dim light that filtered through their bedroom windows. About how people can change when they find the right circumstances, the right person to change with. About how love doesn't just happen to you, but becomes something you actively choose to build and maintain and fight for. Do you think we've changed for the better? He asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. I know we have, she said with complete certainty. You've become the man you always had the potential to be, the scholar and healer and gardener who creates beauty instead of destroying it. And I'd become someone I never imagined I could be, someone brave enough to fight for what she wants, strong enough to protect the people she loves, wise enough to recognize a good man even when the world insists he's a monster. And what of our daughter? He asked, glancing toward the door that led to the sitting room where Hope slept. What kind of person do you think she'll become, growing up in this place with us as her parents? She'll be everything we are and more, Kaela said confidently. She'll be brave like her mother and brilliant like her father. She'll be kind and curious and strong enough to make her own choices about what kind of life she wants to live. And she'll know from the very beginning that love is not something to be feared or avoided, but something to be celebrated and nurtured and shared. I hope you're right, he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I hope we can give her the kind of childhood that will prepare her for whatever challenges the world might offer, while still allowing her to maintain her innocence and optimism for as long as possible. We will, she assured him. We'll teach her everything we've learned about love and courage and the importance of fighting for what's right. We'll show her that even when the world seems dark and frightening, there are always people worth saving and causes worth defending. We'll give her the tools she needs to become whoever she's meant to be. They talked quietly until the early hours of the morning, sharing their dreams and plans for their daughter's future while the fortress settled into the deep quiet that came just before dawn. When they finally fell asleep, it was with their arms around each other and their hearts full of contentment, secure in the knowledge that they had built something lasting and beautiful from the most unlikely of beginnings. The years that followed were marked by the steady accumulation of small joys and quiet triumphs. Hope grew from a peaceful baby into a curious toddler who delighted in exploring every corner of the fortress and its gardens. She learned to walk among the greenhouse plants, her tiny hands gentle with the delicate flowers as she helped her parents tend to their botanical experiments. Malric's work with the Healers Guild proved to be even more successful than anyone had anticipated. The crimson bellflower treatment not only helped with the wasting sickness, but showed promise for several other conditions as well. He found himself traveling occasionally to other parts of the kingdom, sharing his knowledge and learning from colleagues who had once feared to associate with the Dark Sorcerer. Kaela discovered that she had a talent for managing the complex logistics of their expanded research program. She coordinated with suppliers and distributors, managed correspondence with other institutions, and even began writing papers of her own about the practical applications of magical botany. She had never imagined that she might become a scholar in her own right, but the intellectual challenges energized her in ways she had never expected. Their second child was born when Hope was 3 years old, a son they named after Finn in honor of the brother whose crisis had brought them together. Young Finn proved to be as different from his sister as possible, energetic and mischievous where she was contemplative and careful, but no less beloved for his more challenging personality. He's going to keep us busy, Malric observed one afternoon as they watched their son attempt to climb one of the garden trellises, while his sister tried to talk him down with the patient voice of someone far older than her. Years. Good, Kaela said, laughing as Hope finally convinced her brother to come down by offering to show him the new butterfly chrysalises in the greenhouse. Busy is good. Busy means we're living fully, engaging with the world instead of hiding from it. As their children grew, the fortress became a gathering place for scholars and healers from across the kingdom. What had once been a place of exile and isolation was transformed into a center of learning and innovation, where magical and mundane knowledge combined to create solutions for problems that had plagued humanity for generations. Finn the Elder became a regular visitor, eventually accepting a permanent position helping to manage the expanded research program. He had developed his own expertise in the preservation and distribution of medicinal preparations, skills that proved invaluable as their work reached larger and larger populations. "Do you remember," he said one evening as the extended family gathered for dinner, "when we used to sit in our little farmhouse and dream about making a difference in the world? We thought we'd do it through politics or activism, by changing minds and hearts through persuasion and argument. Instead, we did it through love and scholarship and the patient work of growing things," Kaela replied, watching her children play quietly in the corner while the adults talked. "It turns out that there are many ways to change the world, and some of them are quieter and more gradual than others. But no less effective," Malric added, his arm around his wife's shoulders as he looked out at the gardens that had become a symbol of everything they had built together. "Sometimes the most profound changes come not from dramatic gestures, but from the accumulation of small acts of kindness and courage and love. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, they walked together through the gardens as they had done countless times before, but tonight felt different, more ceremonial. As though they were marking not just the passage of time but the successful completion of a great work. Hope and young Finn ran ahead of them, chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk while their parents followed at a more leisurely pace. 10 years, Kaela mused, her hand in his as they walked the familiar paths. It seems like both forever and no time at all. Forever in the best possible way, he agreed. I can barely remember what my life was like before you came to me, desperate and brave and absolutely certain that you could save your brother through sheer force of will. I could, she said with a smile. I did save him. I just didn't realize that I would save myself in the process, or that I would find the love of my life along the way. They paused at the spot where they had first kissed, in the greenhouse among the plants that had taught them both about the patience required for growth and the faith necessary to tend something beautiful without knowing exactly what it would become. The structure had been expanded several times over the years, but this original section remained unchanged, a shrine to the quiet moments that had allowed their love to take root and flourish. If you could go back, he asked, echoing the question they had discussed so many times over the years. Knowing everything you know now, would you make the same choice? Would you still come to my fortress and offer yourself as my bride? Without hesitation, she replied immediately. I would make that choice 1,000 times over, in 1,000 different circumstances. I would choose you, choose this life, choose this love, no matter what the cost might be. Even knowing the dangers you would face? The conspiracies and threats and risks to your own life? Especially knowing those things, she said firmly, because now I also know how it ends. I know that we survive, that we thrive, that we build something beautiful and lasting together. I know that love really is stronger than fear, that courage really can overcome impossible odds, that two people who choose each other can create a family and a legacy that will outlast any temporary troubles. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to the simple gold band that had marked her as his wife for 10 years. The gesture was one he had repeated countless times, but it still carried the same weight of promise and commitment that it had on their wedding day. I love you, Kaela, he said, the words as fresh and meaningful as they had been the first time he spoke them. I love the brave woman who saved her brother, the brilliant scholar who helps me with my research, the devoted mother who raises our children with such wisdom and kindness. I love my wife, my partner, my dearest friend. And I love you, she replied, standing on her toes to kiss him as their children's laughter echoed through the garden around them. I love the man who is gentle with a desperate stranger, the scholar who uses his gifts to heal instead of harm, the father who tends to our children's growth with the same care he shows his plants. I love my husband, my partner in everything that matters. The kiss they shared was witnessed by fireflies and flowers, by the children who were their greatest joy and the home they had built together through patience and love and the kind of daily courage that transforms ordinary lives into extraordinary ones. It was a kiss that tasted of anniversary wine and future dreams, of past challenges overcome and present contentment earned through the simple but profound choice to love each other completely. As the stars emerged overhead and their children finally tired of chasing lights through the garden, the family made their way back to the fortress that had become their sanctuary and their kingdom. Inside, the rooms were warm with lamplight and filled with the comfortable evidence of lives fully lived. Books and toys and half-finished projects, correspondence from colleagues around the world, and art created by small hands learning to express beauty. They tucked their children into bed with stories and songs, the rituals of parenthood that grounded them in the present moment while connecting them to the long chain of love that stretched both backward and forward through generations. Hope fell asleep clutching the small wooden horse her father had carved for her, while young Finn curled up with the blanket his Aunt Kaela had knitted during her pregnancy. Later, as they prepared for bed themselves, Kaela caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused to study the woman looking back at her. The face was older than the one that had first approached this fortress 10 years ago. marked by the passage of time and the experiences that had shaped her into who she had become. But the eyes were brighter, more confident, filled with the kind of deep satisfaction that came from a life lived in alignment with one's deepest values. "What do you see?" Malric asked, coming to stand behind her and meeting her gaze in the mirror. "I see a woman who found her courage," she said thoughtfully. "I see someone who learned that love is not a weakness to be feared but a strength to be cultivated. I see a wife and mother and scholar who built something meaningful with her life." She leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him supporting her. "I see someone who chose love over fear, adventure over safety, growth over stagnation. I see someone who is exactly where she belongs." "I see all of that too," he murmured against her hair. "But mostly, I see the woman I fell in love with 10 years ago. The one who was brave enough to walk into a stranger's home and honest enough to admit that she was making a bargain rather than pretending to emotions she didn't feel. His arms tightened around her waist. "I see my wife who taught me that it's never too late to become the person you are meant to be." They made love that night with the passion of new lovers and the deep affection of old friends, their bodies moving together in rhythms learned over years of practice and devotion. It was love-making that celebrated not just their anniversary but their entire journey together. From the cautious exploration of their early marriage through the desperate separation that had tested their bond to the profound partnership they had built through choice and commitment and daily acts of love. Afterward, as they lay together in the darkness, Kaela reflected on the impossible journey that had brought them to this moment. She had begun as a desperate woman with nothing to offer but her willingness to sacrifice herself for someone she loved. She had become a cherished wife, a devoted mother, a respected scholar, and most importantly, a woman who had learned to value herself as much as she valued others. The transformation had not been easy or automatic. It had required courage and patience and the willingness to grow into someone new. It had demanded that she learn to trust not just her husband but herself, to believe that she was worthy of the love and respect he offered her so freely. Most importantly, it had taught her that love was not something that simply happened to you, like weather or fate, but something you chose to build and maintain and fight for every single day. Love was the decision to see the best in someone even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Love was the commitment to grow together rather than apart, to face challenges as partners rather than opponents, to create something beautiful and lasting from the raw materials of hope and determination and mutual respect. As she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together, Kaela smiled at the memory of the frightened woman who had once stood outside these gates, uncertain of her welcome but absolutely certain of her love for her brother. That woman could never have imagined the happiness that waited for her beyond those intimidating walls, could never have envisioned the love that would transform not just her circumstances, but her very understanding of what was possible. The last thing she thought before sleep claimed her was a prayer of gratitude, not to any particular deity, but to the mysterious forces that had conspired to bring her exactly where she needed to be. She had come to save her brother and had ended up saving herself. She had offered herself as a bride and had discovered what it truly meant to be a wife. She had sacrificed her old life and had been given a new one beyond her wildest dreams. In the morning, she would wake to the sound of children's laughter and the scent of flowers blooming in the greenhouse. She would spend her day in the work she loved, surrounded by people who valued her mind and her heart in equal measure. She would end the day in the arms of a man who had chosen her as completely as she had chosen him, who loved her not despite her strength and independence, but because of them. It was, she knew with the certainty that came from years of testing and proving, exactly the life she had been meant to live. And it had all begun with a single desperate choice, a willingness to risk everything for love, and the courage to walk through gates that led not to sacrifice but to salvation. The story of the villain's bride had become something far more beautiful than anyone could have predicted. The story of two lonely people who had found in each other not just companionship but transformation, not just love but the courage to become the best versions of themselves. It was a story that would be told and retold in the years to come, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of desperate bargains, but as a celebration of the power of love to redeem and transform and create beauty from the most unlikely circumstances. And in the fortress on the hill, surrounded by gardens that bloomed year-round and filled with the laughter of children who had never known a world without love, that story continued to unfold with each passing day, each small choice to choose kindness over cruelty, growth over stagnation, love over fear. It was a story without end, because true love stories never really finish. They simply expand and deepen and grow more beautiful with each chapter that life writes upon the willing hearts of those brave enough to believe in their own capacity for transformation.